Ideology really became something in public discourse. It blew up. The ideology really blew up. Of course, there used to be communist ideology and capitalist ideology. And during the Cold War, this was something that really came of age in the Cold War era, from the Cold War mentality. And yet, it also had a different lineage, which was really in the French. If you look at Hayek's critique of scientism, he points out that ideology was actually originally a branch of zoology. It was, psychology avant les lettres. Condillac, Cabani, and then Tracy, who then came up with this whole economic theory of value. But this pejorative meaning was actually given to the term ideology by Napoleon, who found critics basically of his imperial economic policy amongst these ideologues. So he started to call everybody who had a set of ideas that he didn't like ideologues and ideology. But ideology became this wasn't exactly like just a rebirth of the pejorative, Napoleonic in origin, Cold War mentality where you call your enemy an ideologue, whereas your people are intellectual. There was also academia talking about ideology, and the main theorist was Althusser. This was really important to me when I was starting to learn about theory. The idea that there is no outside to ideology. Men make history, men make ideas, but they do not make them as they like. Of course, the thinker of our time, and who defines the afterlife of theory, Slavoje Zizek. Was this ideology his master signifier? Was this his master concept? Probably. Maybe. Well, that's what we have to answer, like in this video, Words Without Books. One or Several Slavoje. I'm getting this from One or Several Wolves by Deleuzean-Foucauldian. In Words Without Books, I'm thinking Organs Without Bodies. What made Slavoje the first thinker of the afterlife of theory? Well, before we get into that, looking at these, it reminds me of that scene in Vertigo where they drive out to the redwoods in Marin and they're walking around and Jimmy Stewart's like, well, there's a cross-section of one of the old trees that's been cut down. Madeline, what are you thinking about? Points at the tree, at the rings, and she's like, somewhere in here I started reading theory, and there I stopped. It was only a moment for you. Words without books. Words without books. What we can do is talk about the historical conditions of possibility of this person. Now, it's impressive, but what's even more striking is when you actually add in the previous 20 years of Zizek's career. His 1972 first book, in Slovenian, not available in English, The Pain of Difference, was Derridian. Zizek says he doesn't like the title. So he rebranded as Lacan. However, I propose something that a lot of people don't talk about, thinking of Zizek as Derrida without Derrida. Derrida talking about cinema. Actually, there's a whole book now on the fact that Derrida never talked about cinema. Zizek made his career talking about cinema from the perspective of a Derridian masked as a Lacanian. Of course, Lacan was important to film theory. Zizek was more Lacanian than film theory, but wasn't he really Derridian underneath that? What does it mean to be a Derridian in a Lacanian mask? Well, what links Derrida to Lacan is a sense of the impossibility. For Lacan, it's a certain impossibility of getting what we want in human relationships or in human affairs in general, because there's this dynamic from Freud to Lacan where all of our access to reality and to the closest ones to us, the others who populate our reality, all of that is mediated by these mental, emotional structures that are set up in our earliest childhood, built up by our bodily experiences of aggression and trauma, need for love, occasionally the experience of having our needs met by a loving caregiver. But when we come into adulthood, the realization from Freud to Lacan is that we really just superimpose our childhood illusions onto all of our adult objects, these others that populate our reality. And the way that these structures have formed are different from person to person. And there's a power struggle within those structures as we struggle to meet what we now imagine to be our desires and what we need as adults. But it's actually just the unfolding of these power struggles we've experienced as a small child. And what Derrida did with that was to take that to philosophy. Did he take it from Lacan and bring it to philosophy? I mean, Derrida obviously was looking at Lacan, although he cites him sparingly. So was Derrida already masking as Lacan, so that when Zizek comes along and masks as a Lacanian, he was always really a Lacanian, even though he was a Derridian? What Zizek is explicit about is that all of this goes back to Hegel, because Derrida was redoing Hegel by making contradiction explicit. The dialectic is fundamentally contradiction. But Hegel imagined, just as all adults imagine, that they can overcome it, but that's impossible. This is that impossibility running through the ideas from Hegel, who didn't realize he was pointing out the true impossibility of ever having meaning, ever having philosophy, for sure. That's the great irony, is that philosophy is the source in Hegel of the very idea that we can't have access to reality. Of course, it was also Kant, who our reality is our subjective experience. There's no access to the noumena. But Zizek chooses Hegel over Kant. I don't know if we can go with him in that. And really, that's the Deleuzean-Foucauldian. They rejected Hegel and went back to Kant and said, no, we don't need contradiction per se in order to address the fact that there is no access beyond the subject. There's other ways we have to deal with that modern philosophy has given us, namely addressing intersubjectivity, and through intersubjectivity, history. Or through history, the truest intersubjectivity, which is all the way tracing modernity back through axialization. Maybe Zizek saw that as hegemonic in the 80s. Again, this title, The Body Without Organs, was dismembered by Zizek into Organs Without Bodies. This was a thinker in opposition to the most advanced tendrils of theory left to our time, that is Foucault and Deleuze. From Spinoza to Foucault and Deleuze, this is the truth of the modern West. You know that Foucault and Derrida had some issues regarding the origins of madness, and mastery was the issue. Who gets to be the master? Who gets to play philosopher? Deleuze and Foucault were ultimately students of the history of philosophy who turned against philosophy in favor of another form of thought. Zizek brought back Derrida in the disguise of Lacan, the mask often worn by Zizek himself, and underneath all of those was Hegel, because Derrida was always Hegel in disguise. So the master of maskers, the masker of a master, the masker who plays the master who advocates for the master. But in what sense do we speak of mastery when we speak of largely nostalgic psychoanalytic thinking? We need another mastery, another way to define ideology. What if we try to zoom out to like the whole history of reason? Christianity, Zizek's whole turn to Paul. What was that about? What was the meaning of this turn to Paul, St. Paul? This philosopher who comes in to turn theory into philosophy using psychoanalysis, then becomes the thinker of this religious movement within the Afterlife of Theory to revive St. Paul. The turn to not just religion, not even really religion, but the turn to St. Paul. Why? More Derridian than even Lacanian. That was the thrust of the Zizekian wave. And bringing Hegel into Lacan, which the question is, what is even Lacan? Lacan to Zizek says that Lacan was the Paul, the Saint Paul, to the Christ of Freud. Which, does he actually think that? Well, I think it's important. Well, or who is Paul really? Or is Zizek Saint Paul to the Christ of Derrida? If you go back into Christianity, why does Zizek want to bring back Paul? To bring Paul back to relevance and using him as an example for how to run basically a new public relations regime applied to anti-capitalism, communism, the left, something, whatever this political program was imagined to be, roughly in the wake of 9/11. It is about the politics of theory, or the politics of the originator of Christianity and ancient philosophy, which Augustine was. So to go back to Paul is to kind of cut Augustine out of the equation. interesting that it connects back up to Zizek's critique of Eastern philosophy today. The fact is that there is no Augustine without Mani. Augustine started out as a Manichaean. Mani talked about Christ and Buddha. This is in the 2nd century. He's already doing Christian Buddhist syncretism. Augustine was a Western reactionary, blocking out an intercultural movement, if you will, like a merging of East and West. So Augustine shut that down. So to go back to St. Paul was almost like, today's yoga teachers coming from the Jewish world influencing the Roman West. But then the irony is that then Zizek has like some very combative things to say about Buddhism, and the stuff that he added in to They Know Not What They Do. He added in about 100 pages of stuff, including this passage about Zen, and it's really interesting, and it echoes something that he said earlier on about Taoism. It's a really funny mixing of metaphors, I guess, when Zizek says in On Belief that Max Weber today would have to write another volume of The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He would have to make it the Taoist Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which I would put that next to the fact that Murray Rothbard said that the Tao Te Ching is the first work of libertarian theory. It actually should be the Taoist Ethic and the Theory of Capitalism, or the Theory of Free Market Capitalism, because the whole idea of a spontaneous order, or of the state as engaging in a kind of non-action to allow economic subjects acting in a state of liberty to produce the best result. You find notes of that in the Tao Te Ching. You also find it in Gospels and Cynic philosophy, a parallel that Slavoje pointed out in his critique of cynical reason. Look at the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. Do they plan? They don't plan. Of course, you could then construct a straw man where it's like, what, are you saying never plan? Well, no. Know what you can plan, or know what you can't plan. Can you know what you don't know? Can you not know what you don't know? Of course, this is the theme from Taleb to Rumsfeld to Zizek, this theme of unknown knowns and the different permutations. And really, it goes further. This theme is prevalent, has been very prevalent in the last, say, 15 to 20 years. Why? Well, look at the passage, which seems to date to several years ago, but which was tacked on to the preface of They Know Not What They Do, Zizek's probably first great book. 1991, They Know Not What They Do, tacked on in 2023. What he says about Zen is, Zizek is rifling through these critiques of the role of Zen in Japanese fascism of the 20th century, including D.T. Suzuki, but he comes up with a fascinating conclusion, which is that in Zen there's a paradoxically Pascalian, radically atheist version of Zen, which says that since there is no inner substance to religion, the essence of faith is obedience to the ritual as such. Comparison to Pascal, kneel and you shall believe, so the act comes first. Now, it's one thing to just keep this in the context of Japanese 20th century fascism, which obviously makes it look like pure submission to authority or mastery. But what if you historicize this? Okay, we're going to Belief-O-Nomics. Historicize this realization that there's only ritual at the root of what we call religion or philosophy, but that this has been subjected to historical transformations. And this is going to get us to a viable definition of ideology. So ritual belief was possible in the context of early human societies because there were not competing viewpoints in general. It was possible to reach a level of true belief in what one does and in what is done by what one does through perception itself. And Kant critiqued this, and he said, well, reality isn't given by perception, but early humans created superstition based on their perceptions. So the cycles of the seasons, this became divine. Merry Christmas, by the way. And as human societies developed in the wake of innovations, primarily grain-based agriculture, architecture, metallurgy, and weaponry, these superstitions took on a ridiculously powerful form, one which could not be sustained, one which was threatened by intercultural intercommunication. It begins to become apparent that there is no true belief at the core of the way people are behaving. This is Socrates' realization. People
no longer know why they do what they do. They can give you a rationalization, and they can elaborate an ideology, okay, that rationalizes their conventions. But the conventions are essentially arbitrary and based simply on imitation. The contemporary theorist who talked the most about imitation is Girard, and it's pretty revealing that Zizek's engagement with Girard is at arm's length. Zizek has this one routine about Lacan's discussion of the basis of what Girard called mimetics, which is envy. But Lacan called it jouissance, a combination of jouissance, enjoyment, and jalousie. For Girard, this motivated all human behavior, was envy and the desire to imitate, which then becomes so toxic that people then have to engage in redemptive acts of sacrificial violence. But Girard also failed to historicize all of this imitation. For any valid axialization, that is a way of connecting up. So you have ritual tribes, you have ritual in archaic religions, and you have the failure of divine kingship, the axial destruction and collapse of the archaic religions. The state and religious authorities no longer bear true ritual. Ritual is then in crisis, and this happens in multiple places at multiple different times, just like you would point out, like the dawn of agriculture at different places and different times. So there's a need to somehow rediscover the meaning of true ritual. Zen rediscovers ritual in this environment where authenticity had lost its value. We typically think like Dostoevsky, right? He's saying that modernity has made authenticity impossible, but this is a longer term transformation. The Greeks were finding out that our rituals aren't based in belief. We're rationalizing what we're doing by imitation. Oh, we have ideology all around us. We have these, and there's a lack of authenticity. We need to reground it. And so by the time you get to modernity, we're ideology on top of ideology on top of ideology. We're looking at Christianity, which was essentially an ideology dreamed up by Paul and Augustine that was a transformation of what Plato created, kind of an inversion, because for Plato, the cave was inauthenticity, and you needed to get out of there by going to the true forms, whereas for Paul, it was believe in the mythology of Christ that I'm putting forward, and you shall go up to live in the great Platonic cave in the sky. So the ideal forms will come down to earth in the form of Christ, and then you'll go up and you'll exist in this kind of, if you will, magical movie theater in the sky. Or that will be all that's left, is the virtual reality of heaven. That is still with us. And Paul was explicitly against philosophy, even though he used, apparently, techniques from philosophy, or at least from rhetoric. He was more of a rhetorician against philosophy. That's very different from being a philosopher against philosophy. Because the whole point for Paul, and also a bit later Tertullian, was like, hey, there's no need for philosophy anymore. Christ has already come. Just worship Christ. That's all you need to know. Shut up. Augustine carried on that authoritarianism, but then found that there was more to explain. Why? Whereas Paul was the ecumenical, like, hey, let's reach out to the Gentiles. Anybody can join. Don't be restrictive based on who's a Jew and who's following the law. Augustine had to draw the line somewhere. Let's keep that Eastern religion out, and let's build our own Western Mediterranean-O-Centric world, which became the Roman Church. There's this thing where Marx said that we need the dialectic, but Hegel's dialectic was standing on its head. We need to take Hegel and turn him upside down and use the dialectic, and not in defense of bourgeois civilization, but against bourgeois civilization. Could Zizek be doing something similar with Augustine and the legacy of Christian philosophy? In the turn to Paul, he's turning Augustine on his head, but it's still the same ethnocentric, Eurocentric project on the level of politics. But the method is different. Instead, it's a kind of, however much Zizek criticizes Deleuze as the thinker of the liberation of desires, this is kind of where Augustine was the repressive hypercontinent. Sex is only for reproduction. Zizek is going to, through the figure of Paul, who had also some repressive comments, not really clear, but it wasn't the focus. The repression of sex in the flesh wasn't the focus. But doesn't Zizek need Foucault's history to actually do that? Because Foucault was the one who connected Augustine to the flesh, to the dangers of the flesh, to making the flesh, to creating the idea of the flesh as something to be avoided. I'm not aware of any, edited collections that treat the apparent antagonism between the anti-Hegelian, anti-dialectic theoreticians, Foucault and Deleuze, on the one hand, and then Zizek on the other. I don't know of any work that goes into that, because obviously Zizek kind of equivocates on whether there can be a reconciliation or not.
Just think about this. The philosophy of the Kinder Egg. If you've seen Zizek the movie, this is like the best part. And then in The Puppet and the Dwarf is the real version of this Kinder Egg analysis. It's Zizek talking about how he was dealing with his toxic anti-intellectual relatives. It seems at Christmas, when they gave his kid a Kinder Egg, chocolate on the outside, a toy on the inside. What Zizek leaves out is the fact that you get these little poppy things that are left over, the residue. They live longer than the toy itself does. These like indestructible little capsules, little mini, like a little hazelnut. They're like a little oreshnik, if you will, that pops open and explodes with historically unprecedented force. Inside is a toy. The toy destroys. The toy doesn't last, but maybe you end up with, maybe some people have ended up with piles and piles of these things. Well, this is an excess, this is the literalization of the excess that belongs to every commodity, where you wish there was something more to it, because advertising, marketing gives you the idea, offers you compensators for the fact that this product maybe would not sell itself, because who would pay $2 for 20 cents or maybe 10 cents worth of chocolate? Who would do that in a 10-cent toy? Who would do that? Oh, I know. A child. The child at the grocery store line begging their mother for this thing. Or father. Could be a father. Of course, I never bought one of these, but the Kinder Egg is philosophy itself. And Zizek himself compares this to the vase of ancient Greece, but really this is philosophy. On the outside, you have Merry Christmas. On the inside, you have an unknowable essence. But really what keeps the whole thing together is this work in the middle, which is a denial of childhood that runs from Augustine to Wittgenstein, an ignorance of what the child is. And that was reproduced in the Oedipus complex, which in the era of Lacan, but not maybe in France, but in the time of Lacan, in the heyday of theory, psychologists, the person who I noticed writing about this was Alice Miller. Dude, the child is not aggressive towards the parents. Children are wounded by the misbehavior of their parents, and the responsibility lies on the parents, not with the child. This incredible reversal of blame from the parent to the child in Freud, in a legacy of psychoanalysis, in Augustine, in Wittgenstein, to the extent that he cited Augustine at the opening of his most important book. Augustine's reflections blaming the sinful child. Inside the miserable Kinder Egg of philosophy is Wittgenstein and Hegel. Because that's the failure of philosophy. Psychology emerged out of the seemingly, to me, unprecedented discovery. Personality originates in childhood. Personality is shaped by childhood. Freud set the terms for that with this antagonism, aggression of the child. Well, it's not that Freud was blind. Like, he was seeing defiance as a part of what children do. What do children do? What do children say? Deleuze's amazing essay, What Children Say. Do they make mistakes on purpose? Mistakes are part of learning. Mistakes are essential to learning, which is kind of the same idea behind the free market arguments. You need to let people make their own mistakes to the extent that they're not causing catastrophic impacts on society. So ideology appears as not something that's essential to every society, but that's really the product of mistakes in behavior, conventions that caught on, made into traditions, rationalized as either rituals or standards, which they were not, because they were just out of imitation. And then connected to that is the idea of cliches, imitating phrases, and which reinforces ideology. It's like a vicious cycle within a vicious cycle. And children are imitating that all the way through. Of course, the beauty of children is they don't just imitate, they also have this sense of challenging limits, which maybe artists and cynic philosophers preserve. In the book that Zizek wrote with Jameson, in one of these sections with a great title, It's a Wonderful Life and Blue Velvet are discussed back to back. So sick, so funny, because really, like, Vertigo, The Matrix, Blue Velvet, It's a Wonderful Life. Here you have on one axis, and on the other axis, where the real erupts into the fantasy authorized by ideology, the effect might be total destruction of the world. It might also be, let's go back to reality. For me, the most important book was the September 11th book, Private Thinker. Does that make him a narcissist? No. But here's the thing. I would, because of this indistinction, really, between all texts where everything seems to be equal. And why is this? What facilitates this is really a problem in the concept of the self, which is our society's problem. The self is conflated with ego. The self is how we understand ourselves. Narcissistic disorders come from, in one theory anyway, ourselves in the world. Social reality is relational. We internalize others' ideas of ourselves in our society. That is breaking down that ability to adequately conceive of how others conceive of us and integrate that into our self-concept. We have a problem. We're confusing our ego. Ego is simply I, the cogito. And just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anyone in this video. I'm only speculating on what could be going on in a situation like this. It seems like Zizek, as cultural critic, has in a sense gone into a kind of Stockholm syndrome. You know, when a kidnapped person identifies with their captor as a captive to the culture of narcissism. He has internalized the categories of that culture, which are beyond ideology, the basic drives for the culture that pervade behavior, and then become ideology, which is then subject to question and critique endlessly. But the basic problem of understanding one another, empathy, emotions, this can't penetrate a culture of narcissism, and no amount of ideological critique is going to fix that. The only thing that will serve that end, from the perspective of study, from the perspective of our modernity and its connection to ritual and the loss of ritual, the only thing that helps is people seeing themselves as historical agents in their interpersonal relations. To the extent that the legacy of the afterlife of theory will be to turn theory back into philosophy, that does not serve the end in question. I mean, the Kantian law is not empty. The Kantian law is to see every person as a historical agent, which seems terribly evaluative, but on the other hand, you need to approach in order to find out who that person is. I mean, this is an amazing work. I mean, it's like what your doctoral advisors tell you to do, write a page a day. This is a page a day for 40 years. Dude, they can't shut you up if you won't accept tenure at any of those American universities. This shit's legit. I mean, put an AI on this, do a kind of histogram, find where all the Hegel is, where all the Lacan is, sort everything out, make it ultra searchable. But the next video is going to be 1,000 Hounds, Allothergy and Narcophrenia, 2025. The year philosophy will still be dead, hopefully.